Marcus Johnson had been called many things in his life: too quiet, too calm, too invisible. On that rainy night, none of those labels mattered. When an armed robber stormed into the convenience store, everyone screamed, except Marcus. Standing only a few feet from the gun, the black single dad never raised his voice, never reached for a weapon, and never tried to be a hero. A millionaire watching from the back aisle thought he had frozen in fear. 30 seconds later, the robber was on his knees. Dozens of lives were saved, and the woman realized she had just witnessed something money could never buy. Marcus Johnson left the military a little over 6 years ago, though most people who passed him on the street would never have guessed it. He moved through the world the way water moves around stone, quietly, without resistance, without announcement. He lived alone in a small apartment above a laundromat on the east side of the city, the kind of place where the radiator clanked at night, and the neighbors knew his name, only because he was the one who shoveled their walkways in winter, without being asked. His daughter, Aaliyah, was 11 years old and stayed with her grandmother most weeks, while Marcus worked 2 jobs to keep the lights on. He never complained. He never explained himself either. People who met him assumed he was simply a humble man with a humble life, and in many ways they were right, though they had no idea what that humility had cost him or what it had been built from. Every morning, Marcus walked the same 3 blocks to the convenience store, where he worked the early shift, restocking shelves and running the register for a paycheck that barely stretched far enough. He helped the elderly woman 2 doors down carry her groceries up 4 flights of stairs. He fixed the broken latch on the community center door without telling anyone he had done it. He never raised his voice, never sought credit, and never let anyone see the parts of himself that did not fit the quiet life he had chosen. To the people of that neighborhood, Marcus Johnson was simply the nice, soft-spoken man who kept to himself, and that was exactly how he wanted it. Victoria Hayes arrived in that same neighborhood on a gray Tuesday afternoon, driving a car that cost more than most of the houses on the block. She wore a plain gray coat instead of the designer labels she usually favored, hoping to blend in, though her presence still drew a few curious glances from people who could not quite place why someone like her would be walking these particular streets. Victoria was 38 years old and had built a real estate investment empire from nothing, and very few people in this neighborhood knew that the woman quietly examining storefronts and vacant lots controlled more wealth than the entire block combined. She liked it that way. She had learned early in her career that money changed how people treated her, and sometimes she preferred to be invisible, to watch a place breathe before she decided whether to put her name on it. She had come to evaluate the block for a potential investment, the kind of unglamorous scouting work she still insisted on doing herself rather than delegating to an assistant. She wanted to see the neighborhood as it actually was, not as a spreadsheet described it. That was when she noticed Marcus, through the front window of the convenience store, restocking a shelf of canned vegetables with the kind of careful, unhurried precision that most people reserved for things they actually cared about. There was nothing remarkable about the scene on its surface, yet something about the way he moved caught her attention and held it longer than she expected. Victoria stepped inside under the pretense of buying a bottle of water, and in the few minutes she spent near the register, she formed a quick impression of him, the way she had trained herself to read people in business meetings. He seemed gentle, she thought, almost too gentle for his own good. He answered a customer's complaint about an expired coupon with patience that bordered on excessive, never raising his voice even as the customer grew irritated over something trivial. Victoria found herself thinking that this was a man who avoided conflict at all costs, a man who would rather absorb frustration than push back against it. She filed the observation away without much further thought, paid for her water, and stepped back out onto the sidewalk to continue her survey of the block, unaware that fate had already begun arranging the pieces of a night that would change how she understood courage entirely. The rain started lightly around 6 in the evening and grew heavier as the sky darkened, the kind of steady downpour that emptied sidewalks and sent people rushing for shelter. Victoria had returned to the convenience store one more time before heading back to her hotel, telling herself it was to grab a coffee, though some quieter part of her recognized she wanted another look at the strange, soft-spoken man behind the counter. She stood near the back aisle, scrolling through notes on her phone about property values, the bell above the door barely registering in her mind when it rang. Then tires screeched outside, sharp and sudden against the wet pavement, the sound cutting through the gentle hum of the store's fluorescent lights, and everything changed in an instant. Three men in dark hoodies and ski masks burst through the entrance, and the air in the store seemed to collapse inward all at once. The tallest of the three, a man with restless eyes visible through the mask's slits, slammed the door shut and flipped the lock with a trembling hand, while another produced a handgun and leveled it at the small cluster of customers near the counter. The third moved toward the register, knocking over a display of chips in his haste, the clatter of falling bags sounding obscenely loud in the sudden silence that followed. Someone near the dairy case let out a scream that was quickly muffled by her own hand, and an older man dropped to his knees without being told, his grocery basket spilling across the floor. "Everybody down now! Get down on the ground!" the man with the gun shouted, his voice cracking with an adrenaline that made him sound younger than he probably was, maybe in his mid-20s at most. Customers scrambled to comply, sinking to the tile floor in awkward, frightened positions, some weeping quietly, others frozen in place with wide, glassy eyes. Victoria felt her heart slam against her ribs as she crouched low behind a shelf of canned soup, her phone gripped so tightly in her hand that her knuckles ached, though she did not dare lift it to call for help. Terrified the slightest motion might draw the gunman's attention toward her, she searched the chaos for Marcus and found him standing exactly where he had been moments before, behind the counter, his hands lowered slowly, but not raised in the desperate surrender gesture everyone else seemed to be making. He did not drop to his knees. He did not whimper or beg. He simply stood there, his expression unreadable, his breathing visibly slow, and even as the gunman's attention swung toward him with sudden, dangerous focus. "I said get down," the gunman barked, stepping closer to the counter, his weapon trembling slightly as he extended it toward Marcus's chest. A woman near the magazine rack whispered something under her breath that sounded like a prayer, while a young man pressed himself flat against the floor beside the refrigerated case, his whole body shaking. Victoria, peering from behind the soup cans, felt a strange mixture of fear and disbelief as she watched Marcus, who should by every rational measure have been the most terrified person in the room, remain almost unnervingly still. "He's frozen," she thought to herself, watching the way his hands hung loosely at his sides, the way his eyes seemed fixed somewhere just past the gunman's shoulder rather than on the weapon itself. "He's too scared to even move." It was the only explanation that made sense to her in that moment, the only way she could account for a man standing calmly in the face of a loaded gun without either fighting or fleeing. She had seen fear paralyze people before, in boardrooms during hostile takeovers, in moments of financial collapse when grown executives simply stopped speaking entirely, and she assumed this was the same phenomenon playing out now, a kind of psychological shutdown rather than a deliberate choice. What Victoria could not see, what almost no one in that store could possibly have understood, was that Marcus's mind was not frozen at all. It was working with a clarity and speed that belonged to a different version of himself, one he had buried under years of quiet civilian routine but never fully erased. His eyes, which appeared distant and unfocused to the panicked onlookers around him, were in fact cataloging every detail of the room with methodical precision. He noted the gunman's stance, slightly too wide for stable balance, suggesting inexperience rather than seasoned training. He noted the angle of the weapon, the slight tremor in the man's wrist, the way his finger rested tight against the trigger guard rather than resting flush along the frame the way a trained shooter would hold it. He counted the exits, the position of the security camera mounted near the ceiling, the distance between himself and the second gunman who had moved toward the register, and the location of the third man still standing guard near the door. He registered the rhythm of the lead gunman's breathing, quick and shallow, a pattern he recognized instantly from years of training as the unmistakable signature of panic rather than calculated menace. Somewhere deep in Marcus's chest, an old and familiar quiet settled over him, the same quiet that had once kept him alive in rooms far more dangerous than this one, and beneath the surface stillness that Victoria mistook for fear, a plan was already beginning to take shape. The seconds stretched into what felt like minutes, as the gunman's attention remained fixed on Marcus, the silence in the store broken only by muffled sobs and the steady patter of rain against the front windows. Marcus did nothing sudden, made no move that could be interpreted as aggression, yet something in his stillness seemed to unsettle the gunman more than outright defiance would have. The young man with the weapon shifted his stance, glancing briefly toward his companions, as if seeking reassurance, and in that fractional moment of distraction, Marcus filed away one more crucial detail. The man was not just nervous, he was afraid of what he had already set into motion. And fear like that, Marcus knew from hard experience, could be redirected if handled with precision rather than provoked further with resistance. A customer near the back, a teenage boy who had been picking up snacks for his younger siblings, let out a small whimper that drew the second gunman's attention away from the register. "Shut up," the man snapped, swinging his own weapon toward the boy, and for a moment the tension in the room sharpened into something even more volatile, the kind of unpredictable energy that could tip the entire situation toward violence with a single wrong movement. Victoria watched in horror, certain that everything was about to spiral beyond anyone's control, certain that the frozen man behind the counter could do nothing to stop what felt like an inevitable tragedy unfolding in real time. It was in that exact moment, with fear thick enough to taste in the recycled air of the small store, that Marcus finally spoke, his voice low, even, and startlingly calm. "Derek," he said simply, and the single word landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. The lead gunman's entire body went rigid, his shoulders snapping back as though he had been struck, and for the first time since bursting through the door, genuine confusion replaced the manic edge in his eyes. Victoria, still crouched behind the shelf of canned soup, felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the rain-soaked night outside, because she realized in that instant that Marcus had not been frozen at all. He had been watching. And somehow, impossibly, he knew this man's name. "How do you know my name?" the gunman demanded, his voice cracking with a mixture of anger and unmistakable fear, the gun in his hand wavering as his composure began to fracture. Marcus did not flinch, did not raise his hands defensively, or offer an apology for the misstep. Instead, he tilted his head slightly toward the man's exposed forearm, where the sleeve of his hoodie had ridden up just enough to reveal the edge of a faded tattoo, half covered by the dark fabric, but still legible to someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. 82nd Airborne, Marcus said quietly, his tone carrying no judgment, no accusation, only a strange, steady recognition. "I served with men who had that same ink. You didn't get that from a tattoo parlor downtown. You earned it." The room seemed to hold its breath collectively, the other two masked men exchanging uncertain glances as their leader's confidence visibly faltered for the first time since the robbery began. Derek's free hand drifted instinctively toward his own forearm, as if to cover the tattoo, though the gesture only confirmed what Marcus had already deduced. Victoria, still hidden behind the shelving, found herself leaning forward despite every survival instinct telling her to remain still, because something in the dynamic of the room had shifted in a way she could not fully articulate, yet undeniably felt. Marcus continued speaking, his voice never rising above a calm, conversational register, the kind one might use discussing the weather rather than addressing an armed man holding a room hostage. "You were infantry, maybe 2 tours, judging by how you're standing," he said, watching Derek's reaction carefully with every word. "And I'd guess you got out within the last year? Because a man with real training doesn't hold a weapon the way you're holding that one, unless his hands have forgotten what they used to know." Something happened. "You came home to nothing waiting for you, didn't you?" Derek's jaw tightened, and for a brief, dangerous moment, Victoria feared the words had pushed him too far, that the careful unraveling Marcus seemed to be attempting would instead detonate the entire situation into violence. But instead, something in Derek's posture sagged almost imperceptibly, the rigid aggression in his shoulders softening into something closer to exhaustion. "You don't know anything about me," he muttered, though the conviction had drained from his voice, replaced by something raw and far more uncertain. "I know you're not someone who's killed before," Marcus said, his eyes steady on Derek's, refusing to look away, even as the gun remained pointed in his general direction. "I know that because your finger's still resting outside the trigger guard. A man who's done this before, who's comfortable with what he's holding doesn't make that mistake. You're scared, Derek. And scared men make decisions they can't take back. Decisions that follow them for the rest of their lives, longer than any prison sentence ever could. Victoria watched, transfixed, as the dynamic in the room continued shifting in ways that defied every assumption she had made only minutes earlier. This was not a man frozen in terror. This was a man systematically dismantling a crisis with words alone, reading details invisible to everyone else present, and using them with surgical precision. She thought of every negotiation she had ever conducted in corporate boardrooms, every high-stakes deal where she had prided herself on reading an opponent's weaknesses, and she realized with a quiet, humbling shock that she was witnessing something far beyond her own expertise, something that operated on a different plane entirely, where the stakes were not money but human lives hanging in delicate balance. "How?" Derek demanded again, his voice quieter now, almost pleading rather than threatening. "How do you know all this?" Marcus did not answer immediately. Instead, he held the younger man's gaze with a steadiness that seemed to anchor the entire chaotic room. And when he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of someone who had stood in rooms like this before, who understood the particular terror of a person who had crossed a line they never intended to cross and now had no idea how to step back from it. The second gunman near the register shifted nervously, glancing between Derek and the door, while the third man, stationed by the entrance, kept casting anxious looks toward the street outside, where the rain continued falling in steady sheets against the darkened glass. Victoria sensed that the fragile equilibrium Marcus had constructed could shatter at any moment. That one wrong word, one sudden movement from anyone in the room, could collapse the delicate balance he had so carefully built. Yet Marcus showed no sign of urgency, no flicker of the panic that gripped everyone else, and that unwavering calm seemed to be the very thing holding the entire situation together. "Because I used to be exactly where you are," Marcus finally said, his voice softening into something almost gentle, though no less steady, "not robbing a store, but standing somewhere I never thought I'd be, holding something I never thought I'd hold, wondering how everything had gone so wrong so fast. The difference between you and the man I was is that someone talked me back from that edge before I did something I couldn't undo. I'm trying to do the same for you right now, Derek. That's all this is." Derek's hand trembled visibly now, the gun dipping slightly lower as something in his resolve continued to crack beneath the weight of Marcus's words. Victoria felt her own breath catch as she watched the young man's eyes well with something that looked dangerously close to tears, his composure unraveling in real time before the entire room. The other two masked men shifted uneasily, clearly unprepared for this turn of events, their roles in the robbery suddenly destabilized by a hostage who refused to behave like a hostage at all. It was in this fragile, suspended moment, with Derek's resolve hanging by the thinnest of threads, that the second gunman near the register made a sudden, panicked decision of his own, one that would push the entire situation toward a precipice. None of them could have predicted only seconds before, and Victoria, still crouched and trembling behind the shelf of canned soup, understood with sudden, terrible clarity that the night was far from over. The second gunman, the one who had been growing increasingly agitated near the register, suddenly swung his weapon toward Derek rather than the hostages, his masked face twisting with something between panic and rage. "We need to go, now. This is taking too long," he hissed, and in his desperation, the muzzle of his gun drifted dangerously close to his own leader's back, an accidental threat that no one in the room initially registered for what it truly was. Marcus, however, caught the shift immediately, his trained eyes flicking from Derek's trembling hand to the second man's rigid stance, and he understood in an instant what was happening before anyone else in the room had even processed the danger. This was no longer simply a robbery spiraling toward resolution. This was a fracture forming between two armed, desperate men, one of whom had begun to lose his nerve, while the other had decided that nerve made him a liability. Marcus's pulse, which had remained measured and even throughout the entire ordeal, quickened only slightly, not from fear, but from the sharp recalibration required to address a threat that had just multiplied in complexity. He understood the geometry of the room had changed, that the danger no longer radiated solely outward toward the hostages, but now threatened to turn inward toward Derek himself. Derek seemed unaware of the shift behind him, still caught in the emotional unraveling Marcus had carefully cultivated. His shoulders slumped with the particular exhaustion of a man confronting choices he could no longer outrun. The second gunman's finger tightened against his trigger, his weapon angled at a trajectory that would, if fired, strike Derek somewhere near the shoulder or upper back, and Victoria, watching from her hidden position, felt every muscle in her body lock with terror as she realized what was about to unfold. There was no time for hesitation, no room for careful, measured words. Marcus understood this with absolute clarity, and his body moved before conscious thought could even fully catch up with the decision. "Derek, down!" Marcus shouted, his voice cutting through the tense silence with a force that startled everyone in the room, including Derek himself, who flinched and instinctively dropped low, just as Marcus lunged forward over the counter. The crack of gunfire split the air a fraction of a second later, deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet meant for Derek's back, instead tearing harmlessly into a display of bagged chips behind where he had been standing only a heartbeat earlier. Several customers screamed, the sound raw and primal, while Victoria pressed her hands over her own mouth to stifle a cry that threatened to give away her hiding place. What happened next unfolded with a speed that left everyone in the store struggling to comprehend it, even as they watched it occur directly in front of them. The moment the shot rang out, the heavy front door of the store burst inward. The lock Derek had flipped earlier, proving no match for the SWAT team that had been quietly positioning itself outside for the better part of 20 minutes. Ever since Officer Ramirez had noticed something strange reflecting from the store's front window, a series of deliberate patterned flashes that any trained observer would recognize as Morse code, tapped out using nothing more than the angle of a metal napkin dispenser catching the streetlight outside. Marcus had spotted the SWAT vehicles arriving silently down the block nearly 15 minutes earlier, recognizing the careful choreography of their positioning long before any of the masked men inside the store noticed anything amiss. Using nothing but reflected light and patience, he had relayed his assessment of the situation, the number of assailants, their positions, their emotional states, and most critically, his request that they hold their approach rather than storm the location, trusting him to manage the volatile internal dynamics from within rather than risk a chaotic breach that could easily result in casualties among the hostages. Officer Ramirez, recognizing both the skill behind the signal and the desperate clarity of its message, had made the difficult decision to trust a stranger's judgment over standard protocol, a decision that would later be debated extensively within department reviews, but one that, in this moment, proved to be exactly right. The SWAT team moved with practiced precision. The instant the gunshot confirmed the situation had escalated beyond containment, flooding into the store and overwhelming the two remaining gunmen before either could process what was happening. The second gunman, still gripping his weapon, was tackled and disarmed within seconds, his confused protests swallowed by the controlled chaos of the takedown. The third man near the door, who had spent most of the encounter paralyzed by his own indecision, surrendered immediately, dropping to his knees with his hands raised the moment armed officers entered his line of sight. Derek remained crumpled on the floor where Marcus had pushed him, his own weapon clattering from his grip as officers moved to secure him, though something in his posture had shifted entirely from the man who had stormed through the door less than 20 minutes earlier. He was no longer the aggressor barking commands at terrified hostages. He was simply a frightened young man, tears now openly streaming down his face as the adrenaline that had carried him this far finally abandoned him completely, leaving only the raw aftermath of everything he had nearly done and everything he had narrowly avoided becoming. Marcus knelt beside him briefly, even as officers moved to restrain Derek, placing a steady hand on the young man's shoulder and speaking words too quiet for anyone else in the chaos to hear clearly, though Victoria, emerging slowly from her hiding place, with shaking legs, caught fragments of the exchange. "This isn't the end of your story," Marcus said softly. "You're going to carry this, but you don't have to let it define everything that comes after. Get help, real help. You deserve that chance." Derek, sobbing now, nodded weakly as officers gently pulled him to his feet, his earlier menace entirely replaced by something far more human and far more broken. The store, only moments earlier a scene of terror and chaos, slowly settled into the controlled aftermath of crisis resolution, officers moving methodically to secure the three gunmen, while paramedics began checking on the shaken hostages scattered across the floor. Victoria remained rooted near the back aisle for several long seconds, her mind, struggling to reconcile the man she had dismissively assumed was frozen in fear, with the figure who had just orchestrated the de-escalation of an armed robbery, using nothing but words, patience, and an almost supernatural read on human behavior under pressure. As officers led the three young men out into the rain-soaked night, Marcus remained behind, speaking quietly with Officer Ramirez, who approached him with an expression that mixed professional gratitude with unmistakable curiosity. "That signal you sent us," Ramirez said, shaking his head slightly. "That's not something civilians know how to do. Where did you learn that?" Marcus offered only a brief, modest explanation, mentioning his years of military service without elaborating further, the same understated tone he used for everything else about himself, as though extraordinary competence were simply an unremarkable fact of his existence rather than something worth dwelling on. It was only later, once officers began taking statements from witnesses, and Victoria found herself approached for her own account of events, that fragments of Marcus's history began surfacing through the careful questions of investigators who clearly recognized something in his actions that went far beyond ordinary instinct. One officer mentioned, almost in passing, that Marcus's name had registered something familiar in their database, prompting a brief conversation among the responding officers that Victoria, standing nearby, could not help but overhear. "Marcus Johnson," one officer murmured to another, scrolling through information on a tablet. "Former Marine, served 2 tours, but look at this. He spent his last several years of service attached to a specialized crisis negotiation unit. The kind of work most people never even hear about because it stays classified." The other officer let out a low whistle, glancing toward where Marcus stood quietly near the entrance, waiting patiently to give his own statement, like any ordinary witness, rather than the man who had just single-handedly diffused a hostage situation that could easily have ended in multiple deaths. Victoria felt something shift inside her chest as she absorbed this information, a slow, dawning recognition that the man she had so casually dismissed as simply gentle, simply timid, had in fact spent years of his life mastering exactly the kind of high-stakes human calculus she had only ever practiced in the comparatively bloodless arena of corporate negotiations. She thought of her own initial assessment of him, the quiet judgment she had passed without a second thought, and felt an unfamiliar heat of embarrassment rise in her cheeks, though it was quickly overtaken by something closer to genuine admiration. Marcus gave his statement to investigators with the same understated calm he had maintained throughout the entire ordeal, declining to elaborate on his military background beyond what was strictly necessary, deflecting questions about his specialized training, with brief, modest answers that left more unsaid than spoken. When a young officer asked him directly how he had managed to remain so composed throughout the encounter, Marcus simply replied, "Panic doesn't solve anything. It just makes everyone more dangerous, including the people trying to help." The officer nodded slowly, clearly aware that he had just received wisdom, forged through experiences he could only begin to imagine. As the scene outside the store gradually dispersed, ambulances pulling away and officers wrapping up their final reports, Victoria found herself lingering near the entrance, watching Marcus from a distance as he finally allowed himself a brief moment of stillness, his shoulders dropping slightly now that the immediate crisis had passed. She approached him cautiously, uncertain exactly what she intended to say, only knowing that something had shifted permanently in how she understood the man standing before her. "I thought you were frozen," she admitted quietly, once she stood close enough for only him to hear. "When it started, I thought you were too scared to move." Marcus turned to look at her, his expression neither defensive nor proud, simply honest, in a way that felt almost startling after the chaos of the evening. "Most people would have thought the same thing," he said. "Stillness looks like fear if you don't know what you're looking for. But sometimes, the most dangerous thing in a room isn't the person holding the gun. It's the room forgetting how to think clearly. Someone has to hold on to that, even when it doesn't look like much from the outside." Victoria absorbed his words slowly, feeling the weight of how thoroughly she had misjudged him, not maliciously, but through the careless assumptions that came from years of moving through a world that had taught her to measure people by surface appearances, by confidence projected outward rather than competence held quietly within. She had built an empire by reading people accurately in boardrooms, yet she had completely failed to recognize the most consequential person she had encountered in years, simply because he did not announce his capabilities the way the world had trained her to expect. In the days that followed, Victoria found herself unable to set aside what she had witnessed. The memory of Marcus's calm voice, cutting through chaos, returning to her at unexpected moments, during business calls, during quiet evenings in her hotel room, during the careful, methodical work of evaluating the neighborhood she had originally come to assess. She began making discreet inquiries, not out of idle curiosity, but from a genuine, growing need to understand the man who had so thoroughly upended her assumptions about strength, leadership, and quiet competence. What she discovered painted a portrait far richer and more complicated than the brief, understated statement he had given police. Marcus Johnson had indeed served as a crisis negotiator during his final years in the military, deployed to situations involving hostage standoffs, volatile civilian extractions, and high-stakes negotiations, where a single misstep could cost dozens of lives. He had been decorated multiple times for actions that remained largely classified, situations where his calm, methodical approach to de-escalation had saved both military personnel and civilians caught in impossible circumstances. He had left that life behind after a particularly devastating deployment, one that Victoria's research could only partially piece together through redacted reports and brief mentions in military records, an incident that had clearly weighed heavily enough on him that he chose to walk away from a career that could have led to lucrative private security work, government contracts, or specialized consulting positions, paying many times what he currently earned restocking shelves at a convenience store. Instead, he had returned home to raise his daughter, choosing a life of deliberate simplicity over the recognition and compensation his skills could easily have commanded. Victoria learned, through a contact in the private security industry, that Marcus had in fact turned down several substantial offers over the years, opportunities that would have provided him significant financial security, opportunities he declined without explanation, preferring instead the quiet, unremarkable existence that allowed him to be present for his daughter's life rather than absent on assignments that would have taken him away from her for months at a time. The more Victoria learned, the more she found herself genuinely moved by the depth of a choice that most people in his position would never have made, a deliberate selection of ordinary life over extraordinary compensation, of presence over prestige. What struck her most profoundly, more than his skill, more than his courage, more than the sheer competence he had displayed under unimaginable pressure, was the complete absence of any desire on his part to be recognized for any of it. He had never mentioned his background to neighbors, coworkers, or even casual acquaintances. He carried the weight of what he had done and what he was capable of doing entirely alone, asking nothing from anyone in return, content to live a life defined by quiet contribution rather than public acknowledgement. Victoria, who had spent her entire career building visibility, cultivating reputation, and leveraging recognition into opportunity, found herself confronting an entirely different model of human worth, one she realized she had never fully considered before. She reached out to him roughly 2 weeks after the incident, requesting a meeting through a careful, respectful message, rather than showing up unannounced, mindful now of how thoroughly she had misread him during their first encounter, and determined not to repeat that mistake. Marcus agreed to meet her at a small coffee shop near his apartment, arriving precisely on time, dressed simply, carrying himself with the same understated calm she now understood was not timidity, but a kind of hard-won, deliberate peace. "I wanted to thank you properly," Victoria began, once they had settled into a quiet corner table, rain once again tapping gently against the window beside them, a soft echo of the storm that had brought them together weeks earlier. "And I wanted to offer you something, if you're interested. I'm restructuring the security operations for my entire company, and frankly, I've never seen anyone handle a crisis the way you did. I'd like you to consider becoming our director of security. The compensation would be substantial, more than substantial, and the work would actually use everything you spent years learning." Marcus listened patiently, his expression thoughtful rather than dismissive, clearly considering her offer with genuine respect, even as something in his eyes suggested he already knew his answer. "I appreciate that," he said finally, "more than you probably realize. But I don't want a position like that. I spent years of my life in rooms where the stakes were measured in human lives, where every decision carried weight I can't fully explain to people who haven't been there. I walked away from that world because I needed to build something quieter, something that let me be present for my daughter rather than disappearing into work that consumed everything else." Victoria nodded slowly, absorbing his words without the immediate urge to counter or persuade that typically characterized her professional negotiations. "Then what do you want?" she asked, genuinely curious now rather than simply tactical, recognizing that this conversation had moved beyond business into something more personal, more essential. Marcus considered the question carefully before answering, his gaze steady on hers in a way that felt less like confrontation and more like honest, unguarded reflection. "I want a place where people are treated with respect," he said finally, "where the people doing the actual work, the people on the floor, behind the counter, in the back rooms nobody thinks about, are valued for who they are, rather than overlooked because they don't hold impressive titles. I've spent most of my life around people who carry enormous weight quietly, without recognition, without compensation that matches what they actually contribute. If you want to do something meaningful with what you witnessed that night, build something that honors that, rather than simply hiring me to manage threats for a company that probably doesn't think much about the people stocking its shelves." His words landed with a weight that Victoria felt settle deep in her chest, a quiet but undeniable challenge that cut through years of business instincts trained to measure value primarily in financial terms. She sat with his response for a long moment, the coffee shop's gentle ambient noise filling the silence between them, before she finally spoke again, her voice softer now, more reflective than she had allowed herself to be in years of carefully guarded professional interactions. "You're right," she admitted slowly. "I've spent my entire career building wealth without really stopping to consider what it costs the people who make that wealth possible. I think I needed someone to say that to me directly, without trying to sell me something or ask for something in return." Marcus offered a small, genuine smile, the first she had seen from him since the night of the robbery, and something in that simple expression carried more warmth than any elaborate gesture could have conveyed. In the months that followed, Victoria began a quiet but determined process of reshaping the culture within her company, starting with concrete changes that went far beyond symbolic gestures. She raised baseline wages across every department, implemented genuine pathways for advancement that did not depend on connections or credentials alone, and established mental health resources, specifically designed for employees who had served in the military or law enforcement. Recognizing through her experience with Marcus how rarely such support reached the people who needed it most, she consulted with him throughout this process, not as an employee, but as an advisor whose perspective she had come to value deeply, his insight shaping decisions in ways that surprised even her own leadership team. The most significant initiative to emerge from their continued conversations was the creation of a training center, an institution designed specifically to teach crisis management, negotiation, and de-escalation skills to people who might otherwise never have access to such specialized education: security personnel, social workers, teachers, community organizers, anyone whose daily work placed them in situations requiring exactly the kind of calm, methodical thinking Marcus had demonstrated that rainy night. Victoria funded the center entirely, insisting that tuition remain free for anyone who could not otherwise afford such training, determined that the lessons she had learned through Marcus's example would extend outward to benefit communities far beyond her own immediate sphere. Marcus agreed to serve as the center's lead instructor, not for the salary Victoria offered, which he again declined in favor of a far more modest arrangement, but because the work finally allowed him to use everything he had learned during his years of service in a way that felt aligned with the quiet life he had built for himself and his daughter. He could teach during the day, return home each evening to help Aaliyah with her homework, and know that the skills he had once used in classified, high-stakes military operations were now being passed on to people who would use them to protect their own communities, their own families, their own quiet corners of the world. The center opened on a bright, clear morning nearly 8 months after the night of the robbery, a modest but well-equipped facility tucked into a renovated building not far from the convenience store where everything had begun. Victoria stood at the entrance during the opening ceremony, watching as community members, off-duty officers, social workers, and curious neighbors filed in to see what this new institution offered, many of them recognizing Marcus immediately as the quiet, unassuming man who had once diffused an armed robbery using nothing but words and patience. During her remarks to the small gathered crowd, Victoria spoke openly about the night that had changed her understanding of strength, courage, and quiet competence, careful not to embarrass Marcus with excessive praise, but determined to honor the truth of what had happened. "I walked into that store thinking I understood what courage looked like," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the modest crowd. "I thought it meant raising your voice, taking dramatic action, being the loudest person in the room. I learned that night that real courage often looks like stillness, like patience, like someone choosing wisdom over panic when everyone else, including me, has lost the ability to think clearly at all." Marcus stood near the back of the gathered crowd, his expression characteristically modest, though something in his posture suggested quiet pride, not in himself, but in what this center now represented for the community around him. When Victoria gestured for him to join her, he stepped forward reluctantly, accepting the brief round of applause with the same understated grace he had carried throughout every public acknowledgement of that night's events. "I'm just an ordinary man," he said simply, when Victoria asked if he wanted to add anything to her remarks. "I didn't do anything that night that any of you couldn't learn to do yourselves, given the right training and the willingness to stay calm when everything around you is telling you to panic. That's what this place is for. Not to make heroes out of people, but to make sure more of us know how to think clearly when it matters most." Victoria smiled, shaking her head gently as she turned to address the crowd once more. "He keeps insisting he's ordinary," she said, a note of warm amusement in her voice. "But I've come to understand that what's truly extraordinary isn't some rare gift most people don't possess. It's the deliberate choice to remain calm when chaos would be so much easier, to think of others before yourself when fear would justify almost any reaction, to walk toward danger not because you're fearless, but because you've decided that protecting others matters more than protecting yourself. That's not ordinary. That's the rarest kind of strength there is." The two of them stood together near the center's entrance as the ceremony concluded, watching as the first group of trainees began touring the facility, examining the negotiation simulation rooms, the crisis management training equipment, the quiet study spaces designed for people who had decided, in their own ways, to prepare themselves for the moments when calm thinking might mean the difference between tragedy and survival. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, simply observing the modest but meaningful institution that had grown from a single, terrifying night neither of them could have predicted. "Thank you," Victoria finally said, breaking the comfortable silence between them, "not just for that night, though obviously for that too, but for showing me something about value that I'd somehow managed to miss despite years of building what I thought was a successful life. You reminded me that the most important things rarely announce themselves loudly. Sometimes they just quietly do the work, day after day, without ever asking for recognition." Marcus turned to look at her, his expression open and warm in a way that felt entirely natural now, free of the careful reserve that had once characterized his interactions with strangers. "And you reminded me," he said quietly, "that sometimes the people with the most power in the world are the ones most willing to actually listen, to change course when they realize they've been moving in the wrong direction. That's rarer than you might think, too." There was no dramatic declaration between them, no sweeping romantic gesture befitting the kind of story this might have become in someone else's telling. Instead, there was simply a handshake, warm and genuine, followed by a shared look that carried unmistakable mutual respect, perhaps the quiet beginning of something deeper, still unfolding, something neither of them needed to rush or define prematurely. They stood together for a moment longer, watching the new trainees move through the facility with curious, hopeful expressions, before turning to walk back inside together, ready to begin whatever came next, side by side, rather than as strangers who had simply crossed paths during one unforgettable night. The rain had long since stopped by then, replaced by the steady, ordinary rhythm of daily life continuing forward, carrying with it the quiet legacy of a single decision made in the chaos of a convenience store months earlier, a decision to remain calm rather than panic, to think rather than react, to choose wisdom even when every instinct screamed for something else entirely. True courage isn't the absence of fear, it's choosing wisdom when everyone else chooses panic.